So I just heard that the Appomattox campaign, began 2 days ago, March 31st, April 1st. Look at all these dates here. Look at all these dates. Let's just go ahead and the chronology of the end of the Civil War is as such. March 25th, 1865, U.S. Grant was going to repulse a Confederate assault on Fort Stedman, right outside of Petersburg, Virginia. And they prepared to attack Robert E. Lee's forces there. Tomorrow, March 31st to April 1st, you're going to have the Battle of the Five Forks. Battle of the Five Forks, Virginia, April 2nd. Grant breaks through at Petersburg, forcing Confederates to abandon that city in nearby Richmond overnight. April 6th, Battle of Sailor's Creek. April 6th, Battle of Sailor's Creek. And then April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. And so it was the 29th. I want to say the 29th, the Appomattox campaign begins, and just within goddamn motherfucking 11 days. Within 11 days, the Confederacy is going to quit. They surrender. And then you're going to have the assassination, but you still got the battles. But Joseph Johnston is going to surrender to William Tecumseh Sherman after the assassination. Also, Jefferson Davis is going to get captured and imprisoned May 10th by the Federals in Georgia. So April 26th, Joseph Johnston surrenders to William Sherman. Jefferson Davis captured by Federals in Georgia May 23rd to the 24th. Victorious Union troops parade through Washington, D.C. They announced the victory. So their guy has been captured. All their armies have been vanquished. We're celebrating. May 26th, you had some armed resistance to the Union, but eventually the troops west of the Mississippi, the Confederate troops, they're going to surrender as well. Before the dawn on March 25th, Gordon assembled nearly half of Lee's men and launched them against Fort Stedman, east of Petersburg. Breakthrough at Petersburg. I was afraid every morning that I would awake from my sleep to hear that Lee had gone and that nothing was left but his picket line, wrote Grant. I knew he could move much more lightly and more rapidly than I, and that if he got the start, he would leave me behind. In that case, the war might be prolonged, and Grant did all he could to avoid that. Oh, Captain, my Captain. That's what Walt Whitman, a poet, said about Abraham Lincoln. Oh, Captain, my Captain. Oh, Captain, my Captain. He also said, pioneers, oh, pioneers. Have you your sharp-edged axes, pioneers, pioneers. Walt Whitman also celebrated himself. He wrote the book, The Leaves of Grass. Oh, Captain, my Captain. That was what they said at the end of Dead Poets Society. Instead of just fucking regurgitating a bunch of Latin to the motherfucking authoritarian assholes, let's go read poetry amongst ourselves. Turn ourselves into romantics. Let's rip out the pages of the textbooks and stand on our chairs and stand on our desk. And then when he got fired, Robin Williams, and he comes in to clean out his desk, and he goes to walk away, all of his former students get up and stand on their desk. Oh, Captain, my Captain. Oh, Captain, my Captain. Lincoln's boys you had, was it John Hay and John Nicolay? I forget which one. But one of his secretaries, one of his like underlings, which, you know, just adored him so and thought of Lincoln as their ideal hero. They had a whole bunch of jobs afterwards, right? They were one of Lincoln's boys. I mean, so the America keeps on going. They get all these good ambassadorships and secretary of, you know, governors, a whole bunch of great jobs. But they're old men, and they're reflecting, or they had a dream. One of them, they're old men, and they had a dream. And they dreamed that they went into Abraham Lincoln when he was in the Oval Office, and that he handed him 2 letters. And he didn't know how he could help Abraham Lincoln do what Abraham Lincoln needed to do, and he was just happy that the task President Abraham Lincoln had given him, he was within his power to complete it. He's an old man dreaming wish fulfillment, dreaming. This is, he's lived a very long, accomplished life. And yet, what was his happiest memory? When he was young and didn't know what was going on, and he was helping his captain, oh captain. And so let's just read the dates at least, right? The fighting on March 31st fell short of Grant's expectations. Sheridan and Warren did not coordinate their attacks. Relations between the two temperamental generals went from bad to worse as the battle progressed. Let's see here. April 2nd, early on Sunday, April 2nd, following a furious artillery barrage, Federals launched their climatic attack on Petersburg. Grant's troops had long dreaded this moment, but as they surged forward, many were glad that the suspense was over and they were finally going to settle things with the rebels. It was a great relief, wrote one officer, a positive lifting of a load of misery to be at last let on them. Enemy resistance was fierce at strong points such as Fort Mahone, where the defenders did not yield until the ground was literally covered with blue-coated corpses, in the words of one Confederate. Then Fort Gregg, where soldiers as young as 14 vowed never to give in to the damned Yankees. As the fight for Fort Gregg reached its climax, recalled one Union officer, Colonel Rufus Lincoln, the stars and stripes could be seen floating by the side of the rebel flag. Cheer after cheer rent the air, the rebels fighting with the desperation of madmen and shouting to each other, "Never surrender, never surrender." The oncoming Yankees were just as desperate and determined. One defender likened them to ravenous beasts and seized the stronghold. Late that afternoon, by the time Fort Gregg fell, Robert E. Lee was preparing to abandon Petersburg and save what remained of his army. "I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here till night." He had wired the War Department in Richmond earlier in the day. "I advised that all preparation be made for leaving Richmond tonight. Lee's forces could no longer use the South Side Railroad as an escape route, for it had been severed by Sheridan. Instead, they would have to march west from Petersburg along the Appomattox River with Union cavalry in pursuit. This is bad business," Colonel Lee remarked. "It has happened as I told it would be at Richmond. The line has been stretched until it has broken." The fall of Richmond. Jefferson Davis was attending church in the Confederate capital that Sunday morning when a messenger brought him Lee's message urging abandonment of the city. A fellow worshiper saw him rise and walk out rather unsteadily. When other officials at the service followed suit, many in attendance suspected that Richmond was lost. Davis and his cabinet left by train that night for Danville, Virginia, before continuing on to Greensboro, North Carolina. Troops who had been defending Richmond marched south across the James River to link up with the rest of Lee's forces and destroyed the bridge behind them. Warehouses were set ablaze and warships scuttled, causing explosions that shook the city as fires spread and law and order collapsed. There were said to be 5,000 deserters in the city, one witness wrote, and you could see the gray jackets here and there sprinkled in the mob that was roaring down the street. Diarist Judith McGuire went out late that night to see if she could still leave Richmond by train. On her way to the depot, she saw looters hauling away goods. Women, both white and colored, were walking in multitudes from the commissary offices and burning stores with bags of flour, meal, coffee, sugar, rolls of cotton cloth. Colored men were rolling wheelbarrows filled in the same way. She gave up hope of leaving when she learned Federals had entered the city. "I turned to come home," she wrote, "but what was my horror when I reached 9th Street to see a regiment of Yankee cavalry come dashing up, yelling, shouting, hallooing, screaming, all bedlam, let loose." On April 4th, Lincoln himself entered the smoldering city of Richmond, greeted by black folks so grateful for freedom that some went down to their knees. "Don't kneel to me," he told them. "You must kneel to God only and thank him for your freedom." Later that day, as a reporter looked on, Lincoln responded graciously to another tribute from a freed slave. "May the good Lord bless you," the black man said, removing his hat and bowing with tears of joy rolling down his cheeks. The president removed his own hat and bowed in silence. It was a bow which upset the forms, laws, customs, and ceremonies of centuries of slavery. Lincoln had come a long way since his first inaugural address in 1861, when he had endorsed a constitutional amendment protecting slavery in the South, if that would save the Union and prevent war. The Siege of Petersburg. This would be the last bit of this. For Ulysses S. Grant, The next best thing to capture in Richmond was to capture Petersburg, the key supply center just south of the capital at the junction of 5 railroads. Grant moved his army across the James River in the middle of June 1864 and began an assault on the city that would last nearly 10 months. General P.G.T. Beauregard commanded the outnumbered rebel defenders, who dug in behind a sturdy line of fortifications that frustrated repeated Union attacks. Unable to take the city quickly, the Federals dug 30 miles of trench lines along the eastern and southern perimeter, forcing Lee to stretch his defenses to the breaking point. The Union's 41 siege works revolved around Fort Sedgwick, which saw so much shelling that it was dubbed Fort Hell by its occupants. Fort Hell, the anchor of the rebel line, was Fort Mahoney, which earned the corresponding nickname Fort Damnation. The two sides fought numerous battles around the city, none more infamous than the Battle of the Crater. General Ambrose Burnside's corps mined a 511-foot tunnel under the Confederate lines at Elliott's Salient, detonating explosives on June 30th that created a crater some 135 feet wide. Around 300 Confederates were killed by the blast, but Union soldiers, instead of charging around the rim, ran into the crater and were picked off by rebels firing down upon them. More than 5,000 Federals ended up dying in the battle. Major General Horatio Wright's corps finally broke through rebel lines west of the city, cutting off the Boyton Plank Road and the South Side Railroad. By the end of the day on April 2nd, 1865, Fort Mahoney had fallen after massive bombardment by heavy artillery, and Robert E. Lee had no choice but to evacuate the city, and then America had won. USA! USA! 3 branches of government, rule of law, of, by, for the people, of, by, for the people, of, by, and for the people.